Resisting Wars in Central America, Part 2, by Sanderson Beck. Nicaragua's Sandinistas and Contras. Anastasio Somoza was elected president of Nicaragua in 1967, succeeding his late brother Luis Somoza. 4 years later, Congress dissolved itself and transferred its constitutional authority to Somoza. After the 1972 earthquake, Somoza declared martial law that lasted until 1977. That year, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, FSLN, which had been founded after the Cuban Revolution in 1961 by Carlos Fonseca, Tomás Borge, and Silvio Moraga, began a major offensive. The Somoza government was criticized by La Prensa editor Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, but he was assassinated on January 10, 1978. FSLN insurrection spread in Nicaraguan provinces and closed in on Managua. In November, the United States blocked $65 million in loans from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, because Somoza refused mediation. But in May 1979, they released the money. On June 20th, captured ABC reporter Bill Stewart was shot in the head by a National Guard soldier while his crew filmed from a van. The U.S. called for a meeting of the Organization of American States, OAS, and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance urged a peacekeeping force. The FSLN got most of its weapons from Venezuela and Panama, as Cuba restrained itself to keep the U.S. from opposing the revolution. On July 17, 1979, President Somoza fled to Miami. 2 days later, an unusual combination of Marxist guerrillas and conservative businessmen took power in Managua, declaring the government of national reconstruction and promising a mixed economy, political pluralism, and a non-aligned foreign policy. Although the National Directorate was led by the moderate brothers Daniel and Humberto Ortega, the private sector opposed the Sandinistas' emphasis on social welfare with free education and health care, taxes on the wealthy, and agrarian reform. The U.S. contributed about $20 million in relief aid to feed and house those displaced by the Civil War. In February 1980, the U.S. Congress appropriated $75 million in humanitarian aid for Nicaragua, along with $5 million in military aid for its neighbors. In September, President Carter certified that Nicaragua was not harboring terrorists nor supporting them in other countries. Carter's moderate policy was designed to avoid the past mistakes with Cuba that had pushed Castro toward the communists. In April 1981, the Reagan administration canceled the $118 million in U.S. aid to Nicaragua that Carter had obtained, and the president approved CIA Director Bill Casey's plan to back anti-Sandinista insurgents based in Honduras. On November 16th, Reagan approved $19.95 million to support these Contra rebels. Without U.S. assistance, the Nicaraguans turned to others for help. The Soviet Union provided 20,000 tons of wheat. Libya loaned them $100 million, and Cuba sent $64 million in technical aid. In February 1982, Mexican President José López Portillo gave a speech in Nicaragua and offered to mediate to help release the 3 knots of tension involving the United States and Nicaragua, the U.S. and Cuba, and the El Salvador Civil War. Many in the U.S. Congress welcomed his assistance, and to mollify the public, the Reagan administration reluctantly promised to cooperate. After anti-Sandinista Contras destroyed 2 major bridges on the border between Nicaragua and Honduras in March, the Sandinistas declared a state of emergency on March 15th. In December 1982, U.S. Representative Tom Harkin proposed an amendment that would prohibit U.S. assistance to any group carrying out military activities in or against Nicaragua. Edward Boland then offered a substitute with language acceptable to the Republicans, prohibiting funds for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua, which passed the House 411 to 0. Yet the number of Contras the U.S. was supporting increased from less than 2,000 in August 1982 to 7,000 by the following May. 37 members of the House wrote to President Reagan complaining that the Boland Amendment was being violated, and on July 28, 1983, the House voted 228 to 195 to end covert operations against Nicaragua. Throughout the second half of 1983, the U.S. military conducted extensive exercises in the Western Caribbean to intimidate Nicaragua, Salvadoran rebels, and Cuba. In September, the Contras sabotaged Nicaragua's only coastal oil terminal, and the next month they attacked oil storage facilities. The House voted again 227 to 194 in the annual intelligence authorization to ban spending on covert operations against Nicaragua. And in November, they passed a resolution in support of negotiations by the Contra War process mediated by Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama. But the Conference Committee added $24 million for the Contras for the next fiscal year. Without telling the oversight committees, the National Security Council, NSC, increased the authorized strength of the Contras to 18,000. Early in 1984, the CIA used a ship off Nicaragua's coast to help Latin American commandos lay mines in 3 Nicaraguan harbors. But the Senate Intelligence Committee was not fully informed until March 27th, after Dutch, Panamanian, and Soviet ships were damaged, and Nicaraguan fishermen were killed. Then a Liberian tanker and a Japanese ship were damaged, and speedboats with machine guns and explosives attacked the Corinto harbor. By overwhelming votes, both houses of Congress voted to condemn the mining, 84 to 12 in the Senate. On May 24th, the House voted 241 to 177 to prohibit aid to the Contras. Since the Reagan administration could not get money from Congress for the Contras, they looked for other ways. On June 25th, at a meeting with President Reagan, Vice President Bush, CIA Director Casey, National Security Advisor McFarlane, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Vesey, Secretary of State Schultz, and Secretary of Defense Weinberger, they discussed getting military support for the Contras from other countries. Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia had already offered $1 million a month. Casey got $10 million in arms that Israel had captured from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, though he had denied this when he testified before the House Intelligence Committee. Schultz and the White House Chief of Staff, Jim Baker, warned that such solicitations could be an impeachable offense. And Reagan demanded secrecy, warning, if such a story gets out, we'll all be hanging by our thumbs in front of the White House. Within days of Congress voting to end all funding for the Contras, more than $20 million was sent by Saudis into Contra bank accounts. The Contador nations were mediating peace talks at Manzanillo, and in September 1984, Nicaragua surprised many by agreeing to the proposed treaty that would ban foreign military bases, training, and exercises. It meant that U.S. advisors would have to leave Honduras and El Salvador, and the Cuban advisors would have to leave Nicaragua. Reagan's diplomats found ways to delay the treaty, irritating Mexico. In October, the Associated Press reported that a CIA murder manual called Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare had been sent to Contras, urging them to hire criminals to provoke violence at large urban demonstrations, to cause deaths and make martyrs. They also advised them to neutralize, assassinate, judges, police, security officials, and Sandinista leaders. On November 2nd, Nicaragua held elections, and the Sandinistas won about two-thirds of the votes. 2 days later, Reagan won re-election with 59% of the popular vote. After Reagan's large electoral victory in 1984, his administration imposed an economic embargo against Nicaragua on May 1, 1985. The next month, Congress approved $27 million for the Contras, but only in overt and non-lethal aid. However, a year later, Congress authorized $100 million, including $70 million in military aid, for the Nicaraguan Contras to be administered by the CIA. Meanwhile, during the restricted period from 1985 to 1986, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, working for the National Security Council, NSC, had secretly raised $34 million from other countries and $2.7 million from wealthy citizens as covert aid for the Contras, using an offshore enterprise managed by former General Richard Secord. By March 1985, the secret arms were flowing into Honduras. North thanked Guatemala for its help by promising military aid, and Salvadoran President Duarte let them use the Ilopango Air Base for logistics. Panama's General Noriega had been working for the CIA for 2 decades and allowed them to use Panama for training camps and his drug smuggling planes for transporting the arms and drugs to pay for them. China sent surface-to-air missiles through Guatemala, and Taiwan donated $2 million. In 1986, the U.S. secretly sold arms to Iran for a profit of $16.1 million, of which $3.8 million was spent for the Contras War. As early as 1985, the Central American Crisis Monitoring Team of the Institute for Policy Studies had published the pamphlet In Contempt of Congress, quoting official statements of Reagan officials with the counter-evidence showing that they were lies, deceptions, and distortions. Former New York Assistant Attorney General Reed Brody documented with 145 sworn affidavits 28 cases of human rights violations by the Contras. Columnist Charles Krauthammer dubbed American support for anti-communist revolutions the Reagan Doctrine. Neither the United States nor El Salvador ever brought their allegations against Nicaragua to the Organization of American States or the United Nations. Yet Article 51 of the UN Charter requires any nation claiming the right of self-defense to lodge a formal complaint in the Security Council. The Reagan administration was apparently unwilling to have its actions scrutinized by international law. On June 25, 1986, the House passed Reagan's $100 million in aid for the Contras, and the next day the World Court announced that it had found the United States guilty of 15 violations against international law for arming the Contras, attacking Nicaragua, mining their harbors, embargoing their trade, and violating their airspace. The U.S. government had withdrawn from the World Court and ignored its judgment. On October 5, 1986, the Sandinista army shot down a plane carrying 10,000 pounds of ammunition and supplies for the Contras. The surviving crew member was the American Eugene Hasenfuss, and evidence indicated it was a CIA operation. CIA Central America Task Force Chief Alan Fears lied to the House Intelligence Committee about it and was later convicted for that. His boss, CIA Deputy Director of Operations Claire George, had instructed him to lie, and in 1992 George was also found guilty of making false statements to Congress. In November, the press revealed that the Reagan administration had sold arms to Iran in order to get U.S. hostages in Lebanon released. The Justice Department found a memo by North planning to use $12 million from the arms sales to purchase supplies for the Nicaraguan resistance forces. Attorney General Edwin Meese warned President Reagan that he could be impeached if he tried to cover it up. Over the objection of CIA Director Casey, both held a news conference to admit the Iran-Contra scandal. They announced that National Security Advisor John Poindexter and his assistant Oliver North were both dismissed. After a congressional investigation involving extensive public hearings that were televised, on November 18, 1987, the Iran-Contra committees reported that they found secrecy, deception, and disdain for the law. Democratic House Speaker Jim Wright and President Reagan announced a proposal for a ceasefire on August 5, 1987. But 2 days later, the presidents of all 5 Central American nations signed the Arias Peace Accord in Guatemala. Wright liked this peace plan, but Reagan considered it fatally flawed because it would allow Soviet aid to the Sandinistas to continue. In January 1988, the Sandinistas ended their state of emergency, allowed exiles to return, released some political prisoners, and agreed to negotiate directly with the Contra rebels. In February, the U.S. House of Representatives rejected the entire Contra aid package. In March, the Sandinistas met with the Contras at Zapoas on the Costa Rica border and signed a 60-day ceasefire. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev suspended their military aid to Nicaragua at the end of 1988 and urged the Sandinistas to hold a fair election. In February 1989, the 5 Central American presidents met in El Salvador and planned the voluntary demobilization, repatriation, and relocation of the Nicaraguan Contras and their families. In a meeting at Tela, Honduras, in August, the Central American leaders agreed not to allow insurgent forces in their territories, and an international commission to verify this was created, making it difficult for the Contras to operate out of Honduras and Costa Rica. During the 1980s, the U.S. had given the Contras $350 million to fight the Sandinistas. During the administration of George Bush, the effort was shifted to influencing the next election in Nicaragua through the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which contributed $11.6 million to the opposition. The CIA found $6 million to help the opposing coalition and even gave $600,000 to former Contra leaders for the election campaign. This paid off when Violeta Chamorro defeated Daniel Ortega 55% to 41% on February 25, 1990. During the campaign, Ortega complained that his country was facing an election with a gun pointed at its head, because the Bush administration threatened that a Sandinista victory would mean more war. Nonetheless, the Sandinistas accepted the election results and became the opposition party. The Contra War, financed and supplied by the U.S., had caused $15 billion damage in Nicaragua and killed about 30,000 people, not counting those who died from hunger and disease. Resisting Reagan's proxy wars. If the United States significantly escalates its intervention on Central America, I pledge to join with others in acts of legal protest and civil disobedience as conscience leads me. Pledge of Resistance, 1984. We are not worth more. They are not worth less. S. Brian Wilson. In the summer of 1980, the U.S. Border Patrol discovered that about half of 27 illegal Salvadoran immigrants had died of thirst and exposure. The survivors were taken in by churches in Tucson. The following May, Quaker philosopher and goat rancher Jim Corbett tried to get a Salvadoran hitchhiker he had met released, but learned that he had already been deported. Jim and his wife, Pat, borrowed $4,500 to bail out 4 Salvadoran women and a baby, and they learned about the violence in El Salvador that people were fleeing. Corbett went to Los Angeles and argued with the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, that Salvadoran refugees should not be deported. He wrote 500 letters to Quaker meetings asking for donations to pay bail for refugees. By June, Corbett and the Monzo Area Council had raised $150,000, but the INS raised the bails from $250 to $1,000 and then to $3,000. Normally, refugees who would likely be persecuted if they return to their countries are allowed to stay in the United States. But under the Reagan administration policy, even Salvadorans with marks of torture on their bodies were deported. Statistics later showed that from 1983 to 1986, only 2.6% of Salvadorans and only 0.9% of Guatemalans requesting asylum were approved. When the INS demanded $9,000 bail for 3 Salvadoran refugees that Corbett had turned in on June 26, 1981, he protested they were forcing him to go outside the law. Corbett's father was a lawyer and had taught him about the Nuremberg trials, so Corbett organized a refugee support group and began a smuggling operation in the tradition of the Quaker Underground Railroad for fleeing slaves before the Civil War, or of those who had helped Jews escape from the Nazis. By July, another $175,000 was donated to free the remaining 115 Salvadorans from the detention center. And in August 1981, Corbett was making 1 or 2 trips a day smuggling undocumented refugees. Corbett asked Presbyterian pastor John Fife for help in placing all these Central Americans. Fife suggested to his congregation that they provide a sanctuary in their church, and in January 1982, by secret ballot, they approved 59-2. By the time of their public declaration on March 24th, 5 churches in San Francisco Bay Area and 3 others were declaring sanctuary also. The INS publicly scoffed at the idea, but secretly they sent a paid informant to infiltrate the movement. In August 1982, national coordination was taken over by the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America, CRTF. They distributed 30,000 manuals on how to provide sanctuary, and the movement spread across the country. 150 churches and synagogues had become sanctuaries by the middle of 1984. In January 1985, Corbett, Fife, and 14 others in Arizona were indicted, publicizing the movement. The number increased to 250, and even the city of Los Angeles and the state of New Mexico declared themselves sanctuaries. The sanctuary movement reached its height in 1987, when 400 faith-based communities were taking in political refugees from Central America. Charles Clements, a former Air Force pilot who had been put in a psychiatric hospital for refusing to fly more bombing missions in Vietnam, became a physician and spent a year treating the campesinos and witnessing the horrendous war in El Salvador, starting in March 1982. He saw jets and helicopter gunships supplied by the U.S. strafe defenseless peasants. Others he treated had been tortured or suffered from attacks using napalm, gasoline bombs, and white phosphorus rockets. On March 23, 1984, 200 people went to see Vermont Senator Robert Stafford at his office in Winooski to express their opposition to funding the Contra War and to ask him to hold a public meeting. When he refused, many stayed. 3 days later, 44 protesters were arrested for trespassing. In the trial, refugees told of their experience in the war zones of Central America, and experts testified. The judge charged the jurors that a significant state interest would have to be proved to override the defendant's right to petition their government for a redress of grievances, and he allowed the defense of necessity, that in an emergency, a minor law may be violated in order to prevent a greater harm. The jury found all 26 defendants not guilty. In April 1983, the ex-Maryknoll nun, Gail Ferris, of the Carolina Interfaith Task Force on Central America, CITCA, organized a group of 33 people to travel to El Porvenir by Nicaragua's Honduran border that was under attack by the Contras. They observed that the Contras stopped shooting because of their presence. Jeff Boyer suggested that U.S. citizens could hold vigils in the war zones. By July, Action for Peace in Nicaragua had 153 volunteers from 40 states. The second delegation prayed to be forgiven for the killings their government was funding, and the Nicaraguans began to respond, "You are forgiven." More delegations traveled to Nicaragua, observed the villages that were assaulted by the Contras, and reported back to their churches and friends in the United States. Soon, all the major religious peace groups and churches were supporting Witness for Peace by publicizing the issue, raising money, and sending delegations. Over the next few years, about 200 long-term delegates and 4,000 short-term delegates traveled to Nicaragua as part of Witness for Peace in order to diminish the violence there. The Reagan administration used various dirty tricks to try to destroy the Central American peace movement. In June 1983, the U.S. State Department officially discouraged travel to Nicaragua and closed all 6 Nicaraguan consulates in the United States. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and Customs began harassing citizens traveling to Nicaragua. The FBI also tried to intimidate activists by investigating them in their homes. When President Reagan declared a state of national emergency in May 1985, U.S. landing rights for Nicaragua's airline were revoked. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, audited many activists, and organizers found that their phones often made funny noises because of surveillance. An activist once made a call and heard a recording of a previous call. The government also tampered with and interfered with people's mail. As early as 1981, the FBI had begun to spy on the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPAS, and later, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests revealed that it had become a major surveillance operation by 1985, spinning off into 178 separate investigations involving all 59 FBI field offices, probing 1,330 organizations. These operations were supposed to have been closed down in 1985, but many believe information was still gathered. In 1987, the important testimony of FBI agent Frank Varelli was sabotaged by altering his previous lie detector results and reports to make it look like he was lying to a congressional committee. A propaganda campaign by the government tried to associate peace activists with communism or terrorism, and critical journalists and professors were intimidated. In August 1985, a Contra kidnapping of a Witness for Peace delegation was falsely leaked as if it were planned by Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega to help his cause. This disinformation caused reporters to doubt whether the story was newsworthy. In the 1980s, more than 140 break-ins into the offices, churches, and homes of peace activists were documented. Often money and valuable equipment was left, while documents, records, and photos were ransacked. In 1987, an American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, coordinator in Pasadena had boxes of documents stolen from her car, but expensive clothes and jewelry were left behind. In all these 140 cases, only one time was any suspect ever identified or arrested. In Los Angeles, death threats by death squads were often made against Salvadoran and Guatemalan activists. In 1984, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, designed the Rex 84 contingency plan to suspend the U.S. Constitution, declare martial law, and detain thousands of people as threats to national security after the president declared a state of domestic national emergency. During the 1987 Iran-Contra hearings, this plan was not allowed to be discussed in open session. During a gathering of peace and justice activists at the Kirkridge Retreat Center in Pennsylvania in November 1983, Jim Wallace and Jim Rice of Sojourners magazine drafted a promise of resistance that was revised and signed by 33 activists, vowing that if the U.S. invaded Nicaragua, they would go there unarmed as a loving barrier. They sent copies of the statement to members of Congress, President Reagan, the Defense Department, and the CIA. In the August 1984 issue of Sojourners, the idea was altered to occupy congressional offices and was called a Pledge of Resistance. In Berkeley, theology student Ken Budigan was working for Witness for Peace and was inspired by the original promise. He began circulating a document called A Commitment to Stop Killing in Central America. David Hartsoe of the AFSC in San Francisco liked the idea and got Budigan $50 a week and an office to work on it. He revised slightly the Sojourners' Pledge and persuaded the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES, to gather signatures. On October 9, 1984, outside the Federal Building in San Francisco, 700 people signed the pledge in the first hour, as 200 people spoke why they were willing to risk going to jail. A week later, Budigan attended a Sojourners meeting in Washington and urged a decentralized campaign. The language was changed so that any major military escalation in Central America would lead to protests and civil disobedience. Budigan then compiled a Pledge of Resistance handbook called Basta, No Mandate for War, drawing upon the affinity group structure and consensus processes of the anti-nuclear movement and the handbooks used by the Livermore Action Group, LAG. By December, 42,352 had signed, half of them pledging civil disobedience. In May 1985, the U.S. Congress voted against aid to the Contras, but the Reagan administration imposed a trade embargo on Nicaragua. Activists were divided whether to act. The national organization chose to wait, but in Boston, 2,600 protested and 559 were arrested for occupying the federal building. In San Francisco, 3,000 demonstrated and 600 were arrested. Nationwide, more than 2,000 had been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. A month later, Congress passed $27 million for the Contras. This time, the national organization acted with demonstrations in more than 200 cities as more than 1,200 protesters were arrested. By September, 70,000 had signed the Pledge of Resistance. In 1986, during 4 votes over Contra aid, demonstrations took place in 1,000 places, and another 2,000 people were arrested. When National Guard troops were sent to Honduras the next year, demonstrators protested at 100 congressional offices. 100,000 people marched for peace and justice in Central America in Washington at the April mobilization, and 567 were arrested for protesting at CIA headquarters. At the Pentagon in 1988, 500 protesters committed civil disobedience, but only 240 of them were arrested. In the fall of 1989, there were 700 protests around the country because of increases in military aid to El Salvador. 2,440 protesters risked arrest, and 1,452 of them were taken into custody. On March 24, 1990, during a Washington snowstorm, 580 people were arrested for demonstrating in front of the White House, the largest number for any single pledge action. In 1966, S. Brian Wilson went to Air Force Officer Training School, but while being trained for combat at Fort Benning, he refused to stab a dummy 100 times yelling "kill." Nonetheless, he was deployed in March 1969 to Vietnam, where he was asked to make reports on bombed villages. Later, he was haunted by the faces of the dead women and children he had seen. After criticizing the bombings and civilian deaths, he was transferred to Louisiana. He completed law school and became the director of the Vietnam Veterans Outreach Center in his native Massachusetts. In January 1986, he traveled to Nicaragua to see if the Contras were freedom fighters, as President Reagan claimed. When he saw the corpses of their civilian victims, he wept. He became sick of what he called the demonic American way of life, AWOL, and he stopped paying federal income tax. On the steps of the Capitol in Washington, Brian and 3 other veterans fasted from September 1, 1986 to October 17th. Senator Warren Rudman compared the fasting veterans to the terrorists holding hostages in Beirut. FBI agent John C. Ryan refused to investigate a group that was totally nonviolent, and he was fired after more than 20 years of service. Wilson organized Veterans Peace Action teams and returned to Nicaragua. His team of 9 veterans walked 73 miles on a dangerous road where in October 1986, 11 persons had been killed and 12 lost legs because of landmines. Wilson learned that during the Vietnam War, demonstrators had blocked trains carrying troops from the Conquered Naval Weapons Station, CNWS, at Port Chicago, east of Berkeley. Concerned that 230 Salvadoran villages had been bombed or strafed from the air in 1986, he organized a protest campaign on the tracks. He wrote a letter to the CNWS, and on June 10th, demonstrators began blocking trains and trucks carrying munitions from CNWS across the public road to Port Chicago for shipment. Wilson, Duncan Murphy, and Reverend David Duncombe decided to begin another 40-day water fast on September 1st, and also planned to stay on the tracks to block every train unless they were arrested. On August 21, Wilson sent a letter to the CNWS commander with copies to the sheriff, the police department, the highway patrol, and to several politicians, stating their intention not to move for an approaching train. On September 1st, Brian took another note to CNWS and made a speech in which he said, "You can't move these munitions without moving my body or destroying my body." The speed limit for the train crossing the road there was 5 miles per hour, but the video of the event revealed that the train was traveling 17 miles per hour and did not slow down until after Wilson had been run over. Duncombe was kneeling and was able to move at the last moment. Murphy was kneeling and leaped up and grabbed a hold of the train. But Wilson was sitting and was not able to get out of the way. One leg was severed, and the other was so badly mangled that it had to be amputated. A large hole in his skull was opened, and part of his brain was damaged. His wife, Holly Round, whom he had married 9 days before, managed to stop the bleeding, and Brian eventually recovered. Later, it was learned that the Navy had ordered the train not to stop because they were afraid the protesters would try to board the train. The train engineers actually sued Wilson for psychological stress that they suffered, but he countersued and won the case. No jurisdiction was willing to bring criminal charges against the Navy for this atrocity. After this horrendous incident, the Nuremberg Action's protests continued as more people joined. For the next 5 years, the vigil at the tracks was constant, and almost every train was blocked, resulting in 1,700 arrests. For a while, the sheriffs tried to remove people by using paint holds, but after David Hartzell and David Wiley suffered broken arms, this tactic was abandoned.